I think so.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Allison Hughes, and I am part of the community engagement team at the NC State University Libraries. I'm so glad you've joined us for our second event this semester in the Campus History series. As you know, March is Women's History Month, and we are excited to share this program about the history of women's sports at NC State. The libraries and its partners are working to ensure that our programs are welcoming and affirming for everyone involved. That means that everyone, from event organizers to attendees, has an important role to play in contributing to a respectful and positive environment. That's why we ask you to reflect on the way you pose comments and questions in the chat to ensure that they do not harm other participants. When we speak, the impact of our words is just as important as our intent. Today, we ask that you engage in this program with exploration and curiosity while being kind and intentional with your words for the sake of our community. During the presentation, we ask that you remain muted. If you have any questions or memories you would like to share, please place them in the chat and we'll collect them for a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. From here, I'll hand things over to Friends of the Libraries member, Dale Cousins.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dale Cousins, and I'm a member of the board for the Friends of the North Carolina State University Libraries. On behalf of the Friends, who is celebrating our 75th anniversary this year, I would like to welcome you to the program today. If you're interested in continuing to engage with our cutting-edge library, I encourage you to join the Friends. We host a variety of events and programs during the year, and we work very hard to raise funds to support the success of students on campus. To learn more about our philanthropic organization, please check for the link in the chat, and you can find more information there. I hope you enjoy today's program, and go Pack!
Thank you, Dale. Our amazing partners for this program is the Alumni Association, and I'm going to hand things off to Andrea to talk more about that.
Thanks, Allison. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Sellers, and I'm on the engagement team for NC State's Alumni Association. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I want to extend a special thank you to members of NC State's Alumni Association. Your support helps us to be able to partner and provide programs such as these virtual campus history events. I also want to take a moment to tell you guys a little bit about NC State's Wolfpack Club's newest initiative, Wolfpack Women Strengthening the Pack. The mission of this group is to strengthen female student athletes at NC State by providing experiences, opportunities, exposure, and resources through our Wolfpack community engagement. Their three main pillars are student athlete engagement, storytelling, and fundraising. There's also a specific fund within the Wolfpack Club that goes towards the development and leadership of female student athletes. I'll be putting a link in the chat for anyone who is interested in checking out a little bit more about this program. Again, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Now to introduce our speakers, Tim Peeler and Nora Lynn Finch. Tim is a Vail, North Carolina native who traces his roots in the state to somewhere around 1740. His family has been here ever since, though he personally was outsourced to South Carolina for about 5 years in the 1990s. He's been back in Raleigh since 1994 and at NC State since 2004. After receiving an English degree from NC State in 1987, he's written 3.5 books on NC State basketball and is in the beginning stages of his next one. Currently, Tim works for NC State's University Marketing and Communications, where he writes about what is going on at NC State with its students, its alumni, and its history. Nora Lynn Finch has been a pioneer in women's athletics, going back to her days at Henderson High School. A 4-sport letterman at Western Carolina, she was a groundbreaking collegiate athlete who then devoted her career to improving women's sports as a head coach at Wake Forest, Peace College, and NC State. She was an athletics administrator and a National Association leader in a career that spanned decades. Hired from Raleigh's Peace College to be an assistant coach for NC State's Kay Yao, Finch spent 30 years as an administrator for Wolfpack Women's Athletics before going to the Atlantic Coast Conference office in 2013. The native of Henderson, North Carolina, was the inaugural chair of the Women's Basketball Committee in 1981, a position she held for 8 years. She was the ACC's first female assistant athletics director, the first full-time women's athletic administrator, and the ACC's senior associate commissioner for women's basketball. She has been inducted into the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame, National Women's Athletic Hall of Fame, the Western Carolina Athletic Hall of Fame, and the William Peace College Athletic Hall of Fame, and is the immediate past president of the North Carolina Sports Hall of Fame. We are so excited to hear and learn about the history of NC State basketball. Tim and Nora Lynn, take it away.
I want to start out just by thanking the Alumni Association, the libraries, all of those people who made this possible. And I want everyone who's attending this today, to keep those folks in mind as we approach the Day of Giving in the next week, because you'll have opportunities to show some appreciation for those groups as we go to Day of Giving. I am excited about this opportunity to speak about the history of women's athletics at NC State, because it allows me to visit with Nora Lynn. Now, we could all just sit here and list Nora Lynn's accomplishments and her resume and be impressed by all of the things that she has done in her career as a women's athletics administrator. But the reason I wanted to share this presentation with her is because Nora Lynn was there at the very beginning of the start of women's athletics. As we all know, one of the reasons we're doing this right now is that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Title IX, which was federal legislation that required all schools receiving federal funding give equal opportunity and access to women who wanted to participate in athletics. At the time that it was passed, there was virtually no women's athletics. Although NC State, I will say, I was digging around some archives and was happy to learn that NC State did have opportunities for women to participate in co-educational athletics in the fields of fencing and rifle competition. There were multiple individual participants who were female on those mostly male teams, but and thankfully there were some men's coaches who really wanted to see women participate in those more individual sports. But it wasn't until 1974 that NC State had team sports. First, it was athletics director Willis Casey, who hired a friend of NC State, Peanut Doak, to coach the first true women's basketball team on essentially an interim basis while he found the exact right person to lead women's athletics at NC State. He got a really nice recommendation from a friend of his named Smith Barrier, who was the sports editor of the Greensboro News and Record, a place that I once worked. And that Smith said, if you really want an up and coming person to run your women's athletics, you should hire the head coach of women's basketball at Elon College. Her name is Kay Yao. She's a North Carolina native. She'll do a great job for you. And Willis Casey took that recommendation, but only when, after he interviewed Kay Yao, and she said, Willis, I'd really like to be the basketball coach, but I'd also like to start more than just a basketball program. I'd like to start a volleyball program. I'd like to start a softball program. Kay Yao also is a member of the North Carolina Softball Hall of Fame, if you did not know that. She was a great player in her day. So he instituted those sports, and Kay Yao was immediately successful, but she needed help. And when she told Willis Casey she needed help more than just the graduate student she had on her staff, he said, okay, go find whoever you need to help you, and you can hire anybody you want except for that person over at Peace College who's always giving me trouble. Essentially those words. Guess who that person was, and I will let her tell you the rest of the story.
Thank you, Tim. Just to set the record straight, he was spot on. I not only gave him trouble because I wrote him a letter explaining my disappointment that NC State had no women's sports. He wrote me back with a letter explaining to me how to run my department and not to worry about his department. So the very fact that he trusted Kay that much to hire the one person he did not ever want to see again or meet personally speaks volumes to his trust in her. I guess it also speaks volumes about his perception of me, that he could keep me at bay. This is the same man that told me, I guess this would have been 1980, he wanted to hire a female assistant athletic director. He was not going to hire anyone he did not know. So what was I going to do? And I told him I'd do whatever he wanted me to do, but I surely was having fun coaching. Then I read in the paper, in the News and Observer, that I had been named an assistant director of athletics after he had agreed I could continue to coach. So when I went to see him about that, he laughed and he told me titles were really important and that if I was going to succeed with the NCAA Women's Basketball Committee, I needed an administrative title, which once again spoke, it was not about me, it was about NC State. That if NC State was going to have anyone representing the university, that person needed an appropriate title. So let's talk about Willis a little bit, Tim, because Willis was a man who did not want to be told by anyone what he should do or how he should do it. He was very autocratic. He was very independent. He was a seasoned athletic director. So Title IX was passed 1972, and the world was told you got 6 years to put your athletics departments in order. And 1978, the law is going to become a law that will be enforced. So figure it out, everybody. So Willis kind of beat everybody else to the punch in many ways. The first 6 years, 8 years of Title IX, most athletic directors were trying to figure out how to avoid the law. Football coaches, men's basketball coaches, primarily football coaches, lobbied senators and House of Representative members, all in an effort to get the law repealed. And when it appeared 6, 8 years later that the law was not going to be repealed, those football coaches continued to wine and dine the senators, trying to get football exempt from Title IX. Now, Title IX is a federal law about education, and 2 sentences in the original law addressed sport. And most people think that Title IX is sports legislation. No, it deals with curriculum, it deals with housing, it deals with your campus policies, dealing with student conduct. It's much more than sport, but it became sport in 1974, 75, in large part because those coaches were trying so hard to get it repealed. And sport was where the greatest discrimination on our campuses existed. So pep bands and marching bands, many were not co-ed, but many were. But you didn't see a lot of co-ed sports or women's sports. So understand too that in the 70s, schools like North Carolina in Chapel Hill, Duke, they had large and active intramural programs. So they had what they called extramural programs. Now, intramurals are those programs offered for the student body that are played on your campus, and they are all campus activities. Extramural would be, you've got students from your campus who want to play students at other campuses. And so you could go off your campus and play in Chapel Hill or in Durham. And the Big Four had their great extramural sport days. And they sometimes went a little bit further and had what they called club sports. And NC State still has club sports. In fact, rugby is played as a club sport on our campus. And those club sports were really where women's athletics got their start on many campuses. NC State had club sports when I was at Peace. I didn't know that there was club sports, didn't know anything about club sports. I just knew that the jersey said state and they came from Raleigh and we played them. And by golly, being from Henderson, I knew what state that was. So when I called Willis's office to schedule the next season, my first year at Peace, I was told by Roylene Thompson, his secretary, that NC State didn't have women's athletics and had no plans to have it. So I wrote him a letter and I was expressing my disappointment. He never forgot that. So when I did an interview with him, when Kay hired me, I was a little perplexed, but nevertheless excited and elated to be on the campus. It was several weeks later that I met Willis in the lobby of the Case Center. And that's when he exploded about the letter. And that's when I learned this man is very emotional. He turned red, his lips turned a little blue, the veins stuck out on his neck. Those of you who knew Willis know that when he got angry, he really got angry. And he was angry about the letter I had written him. Well, I didn't know much, and I didn't know much about him, but I did have the good sense to be quiet and let his emotion run its course. And it did. And happily for me, he calmed down and then he welcomed me. And from that day on, I respected this man immensely, that he cared enough about NC State. He cared enough about Kay. He cared enough about getting a women's program started that he would hire some feisty 27-year-old, 28-year-old to come onto his campus and use that energy for the university. And this is the same man who promoted me to an assistant AD when I didn't have any reason to be an assistant AD. It's the same man that when Walter Byers, the executive director of the NCAA, called to say we're starting a women's basketball committee. Nora Lynn seems to be somebody, she played it, she officiated it, she coached it. So what do you think, Willis? And according to Willis, he said that would be good. Now understand, Willis was on the men's NCAA basketball committee, And Walter knew that Willis had done more to affect men's basketball than any committee member in the history of the NCAA basketball committee. It was Willis who said, you've got to charge more for your tickets. It's Willis who said, you've got to grow the tournament. It's Willis who said, you must have a television package. If you don't, the tournament will never grow. And Walter always credited Willis as being the visionary for what the NCAA men's basketball tournament is today. So it's not surprising he called NC State to find out from Willis if somebody on his staff would be good on the women's committee. So then he called back the next week and said, well, would she be a good chair? And according to Willis, he said, not if you're looking for a token. And I consider that to this day, the greatest compliment I've ever been given. That this is a man who hired me, he didn't want to, and yet he respected me enough to recommend me to Walter Byers. And those 8 years that I was on the NCAA Women's Basketball Committee as its chair were formative years for me that I was able to use in ensuring that NC State's women's basketball stayed at the forefront. There is no more complete package of a coach than Kay. And when I say Kay, not just NC State people know who I'm talking about. Every person in college women's basketball knows Kay. We know Pat, we know Gino, we know Jody, we know Kay. Kay became the face of NC State women's basketball. And Tim, Willis wanted that. Willis never wanted to be the face. He never wanted to be the person. You see his picture on the screen. Willis never wanted people to be promoting Willis Casey. He was a behind the scenes administrator. He was an autocrat. He was the general of the athletics department. And he was going to beat the law by getting women's basketball, women's volleyball, tennis, swimming, track and field, cross country, all up and going before the law became enforced by the Office of Civil Rights. He did not want
if I could add a couple of quick things. Nora Lynn, first off, how many times since we're here in the lunch hour were you delayed from going to lunch with Coach Yao because she saw somebody walking across campus who looked a little bit confused and wasn't sure where they were going? And then she stood there in her Gibsonville drawl and told them everything positive and good about NC State University. I think she was perhaps the greatest ambassador that NC State has ever had.
Well, we used to say you never send Kay to buy the groceries or pay the gas bill at the pump, because it'll be 30 minutes before she will come out. Because yes, she will not just promote her teams, but she promoted NC State. And I would say to this day, Tim, the reason that Willis supported her so much was he trusted her. She was honest. She was never deceiving in any way to him. And she was genuinely appreciative. She never spoke to a Wolfpack Club group, to any group, that she didn't thank Willis Casey for the program. And Willis saw the programs as the university's programs and that he was the steward for the university. Kay took that to heart. Yes, she was probably the most active ambassador we ever had. She loved going to Wolfpack Club meetings. She loved going to Alumni Association meetings. And those meetings used to be together when we were there in the 80s and going all around the state. The Alumni Association and Wolfpack Club had joint meetings in Dublin County or Ashe County or wherever. We loved it.
The other thing is, I think from various writings, his induction into the NC State Athletic Hall of Fame, the various things, folks thought that Willis Casey was a hard person to be around, a hard person to be with, because he had very limited resources during his time as athletics director. For those of you who don't know, when NC State built Carter Stadium in 1966, there was a 40-year mortgage on this stadium. And part of the wording of the mortgage agreement was that every penny earned by the football team in Carter Stadium had to go pay the debt for Carter Stadium. None of that could be used for general funds. So no ticket sales, no concession sales, nothing dealing with Carter Stadium could go to the general fund. So that meant for a long time, NC State's facilities took a back seat because he had no operating expenses. He eventually paid off that mortgage in only 14 years on a 40-year mortgage so that they could then start doing other things. But during that time is when Title IX was passed, and all of a sudden he had, 10 more sports to sponsor, 10 more sports to schedule games for, travel, all of those different things. And while he was a demanding person, he just didn't have a whole lot of money. And people don't necessarily, he was known by coaches, by fans, as somebody who said no all the time. But there was a reason for that.
Well, Willis was going to balance the budget. Willis hated debt. He was a very shrewd businessman. When he was a student in Chapel Hill, he would run events like concerts and charge tickets for it, and he would rent the facilities, and he made a lot of money as a student in Chapel Hill until the student government caught on and prohibited him from doing that. So he was shrewd. We didn't paint anything. We didn't put down new carpet. We didn't do anything to spend money until Carter Finley's debt was paid off. And you may remember, you may not be old enough, but I remember when that mortgage paper was burned and we had a celebration at the stadium for paying off the debt. Willis.
That was during the East Carolina game in 1979.
That would be the one. So Willis, let's say Willis didn't excel in personal skills. Willis didn't want to explain to anybody why he was doing what he was doing. Willis was not on the faculty. Willis was running an athletics department that was sorely underfunded. Just because the surrounding in Durham and in Chapel Hill, there were just a lot more resources. So yes, coaches wanted to argue, not debate, not discuss, argue why they needed more money. Whereas Kay looked at it as, I have something that my competitors don't have. I have scholarships. And Willis and at that time, Harry was in charge of the Wolfpack Club, and then Charlie followed Harry, and their relationships were very intimate. They were on the same page. So here's Willis, the general, and he had two colonels, Frank Whedon and the Wolfpack Club. And he determined how the Wolfpack funds would be invested, and scholarships were at the top of his list. So Kay and I were armed with scholarships, full NCAA allotment of scholarships in volleyball, basketball, and softball before our competitors did. And when you can offer a free education to women, now we're talking 1970s, Title IX was passed to change the way students are admitted, that women students wouldn't be discriminated against because they were women. Now, we're on the cusp with sports of being able to give scholarships to women who are being admitted to NC State in numbers for the first time. At the time, NC State had about 17,000 undergrads and fewer than 3,000 women. So it was a real growth spurt, and we had the tools we needed to grow the program. Willis ensured that we had scholarships. The facilities and other things came later, but just imagine this, he wanted the money, everything we spent was for a need, not for a want, not for a wish. And it was hard when we called them non-revenue men's sports at the time, when those sports were severely underfunded compared to Chapel Hill and Durham and Duke. And yet that's who they were constantly being compared with. And they didn't want women to come in and take pieces of the pie when they didn't think they had enough pie. So Willis had been planning, was as soon as Title IX was passed, with Joab Thomas on starting women's athletics. And when he did it, he jumped in like other athletic directors at the time did not want to do. He opened up the Case Dining Hall for the full scholarship women athletes. And he said right away, there were fewer food fights and less profanity being yelled in Case Dining Hall. He thought that adding women helped in many ways, but he also knew that he could get ahead. Debbie Yao is probably the most similar athletic director states had since Willis. They are very similar, shrewd, very shrewd. They're playing chess when everyone else is playing checkers, always anticipating. And Willis loved Reynolds Coliseum, but he didn't own it. Everything was a university building, a university facility. He was managing it. And ROTC took a lot of space in Reynolds. We never could get Reynolds updated like Willis wanted it to be until Debbie. So thank you, Debbie. Debbie's very much like Willis and helped non-revenue sports more than any other athletic director.
I want to rewind a little bit, but in those earliest days of women's athletics, 74, 75, 76, the governing body for women's athletics at the time was the AIAW, the Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, which had a very different view of what athletics should be at the time. They did not allow scholarships, did not allow off-campus recruiting, did not allow various things because they thought the men's game was a little, for lack of a better word, impure to the legacies of what the games were supposed to be. They were commercial, they were money making, they were bigger than they wanted it to be. So the AIAW was the first governing body, but it took a while before folks really realized that that was not a great way to grow women's athletics. And eventually the NCAA came along and decided to take over women's athletics and sponsoring it. 1981 was the first year that women's athletics was sponsored by the NCAA. Many people don't know this, but NC State won the first ever women's athletics competition that was held on the national scale. Betty Springs won the 1981 National Cross Country Championship and then won it again in 1983. That was the first competition the NCAA hosted. Among the next competitions the NCAA sponsored was the women's basketball tournament, and that's where Nora Lynn came in as the chair of the committee, held that job for 8 years, and began what we now know. It's still hard to explain how far in the 45 years that the NCAA has been sponsoring the NCAA women's tournament, how far it's come. Last year, there were inequities between how men were treated and how women were treated in terms of COVID protocols and those things. So we are certainly not at a place where it's equal footing, but from where it began, there has been monumental changes in the sports, especially in the way they are received by the public and the way they are funded by the schools and the way they are promoted by the schools and the NCAA. So while I don't think we could ever say they're equal yet, even in that long term, the strides have been pretty amazing. And Nora Lynn, you could probably tell us where we need to go too.
Well, yes, and you're right, Tim. So the AIW wasn't formed overnight. So in 1967, 68, my junior year at Western Carolina, we played in the first ever invitational college women's basketball tournament. Now, there were women's sports being played at business colleges like National Business College and the Flying Queens from Texas. There were women's sports, but they were AAU. Well, there was a committee put together, national committee of women, generally from physical education, who talked about their college women wanting to play other college women. So we had these 3 years of invitational tournaments 68, 69, and 70. They were experimental, was their interest. And Western played in all of those. So I saw it up close and personal. Then it was from those invitationals that AIW was formed, and they had 3 divisions, 1, 2, and 3, although they were all non-scholarship. And the philosophy was, if the men were doing it, it was a bad, bad thing. The corruption in men's sports, this is 1970, 71, the corruption was these scholarships and the recruitment and all this money being exchanged to get students to go to a school. No. You should choose your team from the student body and play the teams from the other school's student bodies. No scholarships allowed by AIW. Then there were these fraternal twins down in Florida who the brother got a scholarship to Georgia Southern, and the sister could beat him and couldn't get a scholarship. She sued the Florida AIW. She sued the AIW. So we got this fact saying we can either spend our $100 we have in the coffers on legal fees, which we can't win, or we can start offering scholarships. But what we want you to do is not recruit, just have tryouts on your campus and give scholarships to the ones you want to select to the team. Well, that didn't go well. So it was the evolution of recruiting with AIW was forced legally because of the denial that AIW had for scholarships for women. Well, NC State was at the forefront of this. We were giving scholarships the day the AIW said you could give them. I was already giving them at Peace because the junior colleges weren't under the same rules. So the AIW is why we had a vote when the NCAA started championships for women. Remember, I said that the football coaches are doing all they can to get the law repealed. They weren't going to get it done. So what they said was, let's take over women's sports, NCAA, and since we can control them if they're in the NCAA. 1979, the convention at Fontainebleau in Miami, the motion was made to start women's championships for the NCAA. And somebody in Division I had the good sense to say, I need to go back to my campus, talk to my president, and see if that's what my university wants us to do. So Willis came back, met with Kay and me and said, what do you think? Well, we were fighting an uphill battle trying to get the media to understand why we were playing in a North Carolina AIW instead of the ACC. Why we didn't play Maryland. Maryland was in a different AIW region. Why don't you have a tournament we understand? You play a state tournament and then a regional tournament. And you're playing Tennessee and Georgia Tech. And well, these aren't ACC schools. So Kay and I thought that the media was the key to the growth. And until we had the media at least understanding our structure and what we were trying to do, we had no shot. It was NC State and Willis that really impacted the ACC's vote when taken, that we would start joining the NCAA 1980-81. At the convention in 1980, the vote was taken and most athletic directors Division I said, yes, we want to start championships. But because we had the AIW, we were able to get a voice in the governance. Our comment to Willis was, we've got championships now. Granted, nobody's coming and we have to pay all of our own expenses and dues to play in it, but we've got a vote. We at least get to vote. We won't get a vote at the NCAA. So the NCAA changed its bylaws to include women on committees that had any impact on women's sports. And then I'll tell you that in the 80s, that bylaw was modified when people of color were saying, wait a minute, you got a lot of students who are people of color and we don't have a vote. We don't have assurance. So the NCAA took that roughly 33% dedicated to women and made it women and people of color. So the NCAA has been a white male, senior male dominated governance since its inception. And that's not going to change quickly nor overnight. But thank you, AIW, we got an NCAA vote and voice because we at least had an association that we were leaving. Does that make sense?
I'd like to at least give NC State the opportunity to pat itself on the back, which NC State has never necessarily done a lot of through the years because it was busy getting things done. But NC State integrated ACC athletics, I think, as we all know, in 1957, when Irwin Holmes and Manuel Crockett participated in an indoor track meet. Irwin Holmes went on to become captain of the tennis team and the first African-American undergraduate degree from NC State. Not long after that, NC State recruited from its own physical education classes, individuals to participate in rifle and in fencing. And then Willis Casey, who had every opportunity to be exactly the person you were just talking about, Nora, Lynn, an older white male guy who could resist the change, but instead embraced the change. Frank Whedon told me many times, Willis said, look, whether I agree with this or not, it's going to happen, and I demand that we're going to be good in it because this is a endeavor of North Carolina State University, and that's what we're here to promote. Now, again, to go back to your statements, those were federal laws. These were not athletics decisions. These were things that the university, because it was receiving federal funds, had to abide and still has to abide. That is the whole thing with Title IX. It is not an NCAA initiative. It is a federal education law and requirement. So change was coming. Some people did not embrace that. And I do think Willis Casey should be remembered as someone who changed that. But I also think he put the right people in charge by hiring Kay Yao, by hiring that girl from Peace that he never wanted to have around and couldn't control, but bringing you here to do the things that you just talked about. And I'd like for us to at least acknowledge it and know that that success was not just with women's basketball and the 5 ACC tournament championships that Coach Yao won and the 4 regular season championships that she won, but in the AIAW, NC State won 2 national championships in cross country. It won those national championships in track and field and cross country when it went to the NCAA. You know, Julie Shea was a great runner. She and her sister Mary both came to NC State because their dad was a physical education teacher. There was a weekend when Julie Shea won 3 national championships in the span of 36 hours. That's an amazing, amazing feat. But then that progress has gone on. Coach Yao went to the Olympics and won a gold medal for the United States in 1988 in Seoul. Coach Moore, who learned under Kay Yao for a time as an assistant coach, has now won 3 consecutive ACC championships. Has a good chance to do very well at the NCAA championships when they begin later this week here on NC State's campus at Reynolds Coliseum. We are the reigning national champions in women's cross country. We have 4 reigning national champions in women's swimming. We've had a national champion in diving from the women's program. We have excelled in many, many ways from those very humble beginnings, but it's exactly the vision that you guys had for what you wanted NC State athletics to be.
NC State has been in the shadow of Chapel Hill, who has been in the shadow of Duke forever. NC State was founded to take the land grant mission off the Chapel Hill campus, and their faculty's quote to the state legislature was, we want to be elitist like our founding mother, Princeton. So NC State was founded for that, provide the infrastructure for the state mission. And we embrace that. We embrace all the things that a land grant is supposed to do. And for some reason, those who grow the food that we enjoy so much are valued less than the politicians who set laws that allow genetically modified organisms to grow. It's confusing. We've got our values confused. But for those of us that know NC State or are part of NC State, for those students who study at NC State, really appreciate and understand that this is a place where you are allowed to be yourself, and whatever you aspire to do, we have means here to help you achieve that. And what a great place to sow the seeds for some of the finest women's athletics at a time that women's athletics were not recognized. What a great place to sow the seeds. And Willis, I'm back to, he didn't want to be told by anybody how to do what he knew how to do better than anybody. He was a visionary. He just, you know, he wasn't a teacher. He was a coach, in that he could identify talent. He knew talent. He also knew where the money should be invested to get the best return. And yes, Julie Shea, yes. Betty Springs, yes. You know, NC State put its money into cross country more than into the track events. And with the AIW and NCAA, those monies are combined. And we have excelled where we have invested. It gives me great pleasure to see the significant facility enhancements, because that's where we lagged behind the greatest in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And to see our graduates going on to not just win championships, to compete for championships, to win them, but to become such outstanding alumni and reflect so positively on a university that prides itself on its people. NC State, more than any university I know, takes the pride in its faculty, its administration, its students, its alumni, more than its grounds or its buildings or whatever. And what a great university. But I told Bruce Polton one time, if we were to invest, this is the time that our School of Management was really getting under steam. And of course, we were denied calling it a School of Business because we were too close to Chapel Hill, since our School of Business had been moved over there. So, you know, if we wanted to invest in marketing our outstanding percentages of people that get the certifications from our School of Management at a greater ratio than those that perhaps are in Chapel Hill, we would be taking on Goliath. Let's be who we are. And that is, we are the silent killer. We are the ones that you will probably underestimate. You will pay a price for it, because it's the NC State people that are doers. We're not the pretenders. We're not the people marketing ourselves to be more than we are. We are more than you think we are. That's in athletics, and I dare say it's in our academia. I would put it against anybody in the world. I think you would too, Tim.
I absolutely would. And I'd like to end our part of the conversation before opening it up a little bit to some questions by pointing out that on the bottom row of this picture you see on your screen right now of the two women standing holding up the NC State is Laurie Hennis, who won a national championship in track and field as a student at NC State, was then hired as a graduate assistant by her coach, Raleigh Geiger, and for a long time was an assistant coach under Raleigh Geiger, but then became the women's cross-country head coach. She had, her husband was a three-time ACC champion on the cross-country team. They had two daughters, one of whom is standing beside Laurie. She won a national championship just like her mom did. And her mom then led NC State's cross-country team without Ellie, her daughter, on the team. It was after Ellie graduated. But she led them to their first NCAA championship last fall since 1983 in any team sport. An amazing accomplishment, and I will always say that the Hennises are the first family of NC State athletics for all that they have done, not just in competition, but like Coach Yao, they are great ambassadors of the university. I always want to be able to point that out for all that they have done. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Allison or whoever wants to moderate some questions from the group, because we'd love to hear some things from those who are participating in the call.
Yeah, so I have a question from Jim Merrill, and he asked, what are your thoughts on changes to women's the women's basketball tournament this year due to inequities that came to light last year's event?
Well, there certainly are some enhancements, but I fear that the things that I think are most critical on the infrastructure are still being ignored. So the things that we're seeing are the things that the public sees. Yes, we can now use the phrase March Madness. It's not just men's March Madness, it's basketball March. Yeah, that's a good thing. You see, when you're denied access to something, it becomes really a focal point. That's one of the that why in the world are you not allowing the women to use that? The way the teams are seated, the way they travel, all of those things have always differed. But when I was first chair, what Walter Byers said was he wanted to mimic the men's championship in every way he could. And that worked for about 3 years. And then the men's basketball coaches became very possessive and felt like sharing the facilities was not a good thing. Our women's bracket was announced before the men's bracket in the 80s. And as a result, we got a head start on making some of the travel plans for our teams. Well, that didn't work. We needed to come after the men's bracket so that the travel agents would get back to us. That would be on Sunday, and they would get back to us on Tuesday to know where we were going on Wednesday. The women's basketball announcement was on Sunday this year. It needs to be on Sunday. It's been on Monday for the last 2 decades because ESPN required it. They wanted Sunday to talk about the men's bracket, not have to air the women's bracket. So this year we're on Sunday. I understand we're going to go back to Monday. Again, ESPN doesn't think that Jim wants to see the women's bracket. There are a number of things that are better. And I could tell you about those, but still, the internal reporting of women's basketball at the NCAA national office has not changed. Lynn Holzman, vice president for women's basketball, still reports to the vice president for men's basketball. The staff is still half the size of men's basketball. There's still not an internal financial overseer for both tournaments that ensures equity, and there is not equity. But there are some very important cosmetic things that finally there are hospitality suites in the hotels for the team staying in the hotels and their families and friends. That finally there are hospitality suites in the competition venue for the players' families and the players' friends. They have not existed in the past. There are good things, but the key things, the internal administrative operational influence is still not there. And it's not going to be there unless there's another public outcry. And see, the students don't know those things. And it's because of the students and their dissatisfaction and the obvious differences that the changes that have been made have been made. And you know, Jim, sometimes you can know too much, and then I guess I should be really happy that now we have beans to go with the hamburger, but I'm still not happy.
You can be happy with where things are, but not satisfied with everything that is going on.
I'm happy to see some things, really minimal things that are being done and being done well. But the things that are really the tipping point that ensure that changes will continue to be progressive, those have to be made, or the people like I won't sleep at night. It's why I didn't want to hire me.
And you're the reason, and that attitude is the reason things get better. So you know, that I feel like you need to continue to be looking for the next thing to improve and change. And
Yes.
on that note, this next question fits in perfectly. Women's athletics, especially at NC State, has overcome many challenges over the years. What do you see as the biggest challenge women's athletics faces today?
Ooh, gosh,
That's big.
I've got a list, but you know, women in the United States are still second class in many ways. The hiring processes are very often not transparent. So we really didn't know nepotism was in practice perhaps in the 70s and the 80s. It's still pervasive, but not as pervasive as it was. The people that we hire are so critical to leadership, and very often women and people of color are not engaged in the elemental steps of selecting candidates and hiring. Hiring is really important. So my fear is there's a growing, real significant growth in the number of men coaching women, and the women are leaving coaching because it's virtually impossible for the average woman to be a wife, raise a family, maintain a household, recruit and coach teams that are traveling all over the country, and conferences are so large, you're on the road constantly. Very difficult to manage that. The personal lives of coaches are very, very impersonal, the personal lives, because there's such time demands on coaches. I don't like the trend that men are coaching women, specifically in certain sports, from the time those kids are 7 years old until they graduate college, and they never have a woman in the mix because they're not there. And they're not there because it's very, very difficult to meet all of the coaching expectations, be a wife, be a mother, be a grandmother. That really does concern me, is the very rapid increase of number of men. And I don't have anything against men, love the differences. But women, the NCAA rules are making it very hard for women to be coaches, and very hard for your administrators.
And that would be one other thing, that going back to the differences between the AIAW and the NCAA. The AIAW, which came from a legacy of women's physical education administrators and coaches, had about 90 to 95% women coaches at the time that they began governing women's athletics. And during the time since the NCAA took over women's athletics in the 1980s, those numbers have declined, and it has become a lot more often that men coach women. And again, that is not to denigrate someone who's running a great program like Westmore is right now, with the number 3 team in the country and the number 1 seed in the NCAA. But it is a trend. I will also say the other trend is that since the passage of Title IX, NC State has gone from a student body campus that had about 20 to 25% students to now a situation where NC State has more women on its campus than men. A lot of that is due to the federal regulations that were put in because of Title IX, but it's also due to the acceptance and growth of women's athletics and women's opportunities, which was the entire point of Title IX.
Thank you. So we are just about at time. I want to thank everyone for joining the program today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm so thankful Tim and Nora Lynn were able to take the time to talk to us today. And we can't wait to cheer on the NC State women in the tournament. So that'll be very exciting. We do have the libraries and Alumni Association have programs or continue to have programs this semester. So we're going to be dropping those in the chat. And lastly, we have a program survey that we'd love for you guys to fill out as well. Thank you again, everyone, for attending, and have fun cheering on have fun cheering on the pack. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.